It is March 18th, and 142 years ago today, Morgan Seth Earp, younger brother of Wyatt Earp, was shot in the back while playing pool at Campbell and Hatch's saloon and billiard parlor in Tombstone, Arizona. The murder of Morgan Earp is a central part of one of the most famous stories of the American Wild West, and yet we know almost nothing about the life of Morgan Earp, whose story was not nearly as well recorded as that of his more famous brother. In fact, were it not for his more famous brother, the whole life of Morgan Earp might have become forgotten history. The saga of the Earps is certainly well recognized in America. At least 20 movies have featured or included Wyatt Earp, as well as a television series, The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp, which ran for 225 episodes between 1955 and 1961. Many dozens of books have been written about the Earps, including books authored by Wyatt Earp himself, as well as his common-law wife, Josephine. Moreover, various stories about the lives of the Earps were published in many newspapers at the time, and their notorious feud in Tombstone was reported throughout the nation. And yet there's still a great deal of mystery and disagreement regarding the lives of the Earp brothers, including a brother who was central to the conflict that would make the Earps famous. Earp historian Lee A. Silva wrote on HistoryNet in 2018, "Little is known about Morgan Seth Earp, as he was never well known enough to create much newspaper ink." Morgan Earp was the fifth of 6 sons of Nicholas Porter Nick Earp. Nicholas Earp, described by Silva as irascible and by Earp historian Alan Barra as a wheat, corn, and tobacco farmer, storekeeper, constable, cooper, justice of the peace, wagon master, judge, and bootlegger, to name just a few of his occupations, moved the family around quite a lot. Wyatt, at age 13, was just 3 years older than Morgan, and both were too young to enlist when the 3 older brothers, Newton, James, and Virgil, went to serve the Union Army in the U.S. Civil War. It isn't clear exactly how close Wyatt and Morgan became working on the farm while their brothers fought in the war, but historian Roger J. noted in 2006 that the 2 brothers had apparently gone into business together by 1872, when both were arrested twice for either patronizing or possibly helping to operate a house of ill fame in Peoria, Illinois. Despite the local crackdown on this den of iniquity, Silva notes that in those days prostitution was often considered no less moral than, say, the banking business. While there is a much more complex newspaper record of Wyatt's exploits, Morgan's activities are relatively less known. The Butte, Montana Miner noted that he had been appointed a town policeman there in 1879. It isn't clear whether he, like his more famous brother, had been a law enforcement officer previous to that. Per usual, it is somewhat difficult to tease out fact from legend in stories of the Wild West, but author Charles Bennett noted on the website officer.com the legend that Morgan had killed famous lawman/outlaw William L. Billy Brooks in a gunfight in Butte, despite the fact that Brooks is known to have been lynched for rustling in Kansas in 1874. By 1880, Morgan moved to Tombstone. Tombstone had only been founded the previous year, near the site of a silver discovery. The silver mines had produced wealth in a fast-growing city, rife with opportunity. Earp brothers James, Virgil, Wyatt, and Warren had all come to the town. The Earps were involved in multiple businesses, including both mining interests and agricultural land. Wyatt had a faro concession at a local saloon, but they were also lawmen. Virgil was at times a deputy U.S. Marshal, a town marshal, and a Tombstone chief of police. Wyatt was a deputy county sheriff and a detective for Wells Fargo. The rest of the brothers, including Morgan, often operated as special deputies. Morgan was also a messenger, generally meaning a stagecoach guard for Wells Fargo. The payrolls of the mines meant that the stagecoaches needed security. Virgil said in an 1882 interview that the first stage that went out of Prescott towards Tombstone was robbed. Robberies were frequent. But Wyatt and then Morgan must have done a good job, because Virgil said that while his brothers were shotgun messengers, no box was lost or any trouble experienced. As soon as my brother quit, the Cowboys began robbing the stages. The Cowboys were a loosely connected group of outlaws, the term cowboy itself generally meaning a cattle rustler at the time. Rustling was a lucrative business near Tombstone, given the demands to feed its growing population, but the Cowboys certainly involved themselves in other crimes as well, and that quickly placed them at odds with the Earps. Silva writes, After officials carved Cochise County out of Pima County in February 1881, its new sheriff, Johnny Behan, was openly in cahoots with the Cowboys, and thus the Earps were the only law enforcement in and around Tombstone. This would lead to a feud that included Morgan. There were many confrontations between the two camps, a feud that was possibly exacerbated because the Cowboys were mostly Southerners and Democrats, while the Earps represented a mostly Northern and Republican town elite. The extent to which Morgan participated in the conflict is not fully documented, but Virgil and Wyatt both later testified that Morgan had been part of a posse that had helped an army captain track down some stolen army mules to two members of the Cowboys. Wyatt later said, "Captain Hurst cautioned me and my brothers, Virgil and Morgan, to look out for those men, as they had made some threats against our lives." The following October, the Arizona Weekly Citizen reported that Morgan and Virgil had helped Wyatt track down Cowboys after the shooting of Tombstone Town Marshal Fred White. The shooting was eventually ruled to be accidental, but was said to have resulted in further threats against the Earps by Cowboys. Later, Wyatt reported that cowboy Frank McClowry directly threatened Morgan after two cowboys were arrested for a stage robbery. This would lead to one of the most famous confrontations in Wild West history, the October 26, 1881, gunfight at the OK Corral. Despite the name, the gunfight, which involved Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and Wyatt's friend John Henry Doc Holliday, and cowboys Billy Claiborne, brothers Ike and Billy Clanton, and brothers Frank and Tom McClowry, actually occurred in an alley behind the OK Corral in Tombstone. The confrontation followed several tense exchanges between Ike Clanton, the Earps, and Doc Holliday, and occurred after Sheriff Behan tried unsuccessfully to disarm both parties. The Earps, led by Virgil, the town marshal, confronted the five men in order to enforce a town ordinance against carrying firearms. In the famous gunfight, Virgil was wounded in the calf, and Morgan shot through the shoulder. Frank and Tom McClowry and Billy Clanton were all killed. The Arizona Weekly Citizen reported Billy Clanton had shot at Morgan Earp, the ball passing through the point of the left shoulder blade across his back, just grazing the backbone and coming out at the shoulder, the ball remaining inside his shirt. He fell to the ground, but in an instant gathered himself and, raising in a sitting position, fired at Frank McClowry as he crossed Fremont Street. And at the same instant, Doc Holliday shot at him, both balls taking effect, either of which would have proved fatal. The paper wrote that the firing altogether didn't occupy more than 25 seconds, during which time fully 30 shots were fired. The Tombstone Nugget wrote, "The 26th of October, 1881, will always be marked as one of the crimson days in the annals of Tombstone, a day when blood flowed as water and human life was held as a shuttlecock." The famous fight has been portrayed on film many times, but actually the exact course of events remains controversial. The town was deeply divided, and Ike Clanton filed murder charges against the Earps and Holliday. There was no formal trial. Rather, there was a preliminary hearing by Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer. The hearing took weeks and included the testimony of 30 witnesses. Some witnesses argued that the Earps had been spoiling for a fight, others that it was Ike Clanton. At significant issue was who had fired first, with witnesses for the prosecution testifying that Wyatt had begun shooting before the five men had had a chance to respond when Virgil told them to throw down their arms. Another claimed that Morgan had shot first. Virgil testified that Frank McClowry and Billy Clanton drew their six-shooters and commenced to cock them as soon as he ordered them to disarm. Wyatt testified that Billy Clanton shot first. After all the conflicting testimony, Spicer ruled for the defense, saying there was not enough evidence to justify a trial. He wrote, "I cannot resist the conclusion that the defendants were fully justified in committing these homicides." Public opinion was as divided as the town. Professor Douglas O. Linder of the University of Missouri at Kansas City opined, after listening to weeks of testimony, Judge Spicer gave his answer, but whether his answer was the right one remained the subject of considerable debate long after the silver mines that gave birth to Tombstone, Arizona, had vanished. Clearly, the Cowboys were not satisfied. On December 26th, there was an attempt to assassinate Virgil. James would tell a Los Angeles paper he was coming out of the Oriental Saloon to go home when 3 double-barreled shotguns filled with buckshot were fired at him. It is not known who did it. Virgil lost the use of his left arm. Following the assassination attempt, Wyatt was deputized as a deputy U.S. Marshal, tasked with putting an end to the Cowboys' crimes. In a letter to the Boston Evening Transcript, Tombstone resident Clara Spaulding Brown wrote that, although the threats were plentiful, no further demonstrations of hatred and of revenge were made again until Saturday evening, March 18th. James told the newspaper that the Earp brothers had been to hear the Lindengard troupe, and on coming away, friends told them to be on the lookout. They went into a saloon, and Morgan Earp, with Bob Hatches and the proprietor and several others, commenced playing pool. Morgan went around to the end of the billiard table and, turning his back to a glass door, bent down to play, when the fatal shots were fired from the outside. One struck him in the back and came out through his stomach. Another hit him in the spine and, going through him, struck another man in the leg. Morgan was examined by 3 different doctors, but his wounds were mortal. He died within the hour. There are several different stories about what he said after being wounded, but all seem to agree that he said, "I've played my last round of pool." By some accounts, he hung on past midnight to die on the 19th, Wyatt's 34th birthday. Morgan Earp was just 30 years old. The Arizona Daily Star wrote of him, "Morgan, who was killed on Saturday last, was the handsomest of the brothers, and perhaps the most reckless, for at times it required the combined efforts of all the others to keep him in check when he got mad." The Sacramento Union wrote, "So the roughs of Tombstone have succeeded in murdering brave Morgan Earp at last. They had to assassinate him by shooting through a window, for none of them had the pluck to face him in a fair fight. The ruffians are all cowards when put to the test." At the coroner's inquest, Marietta Spence, wife of cowboy Peter Spence, implicated her husband, along with Frank Stillwell, who had once been a deputy town sheriff, and 3 other men in the murder, testifying, "Spence didn't tell me so, but I know he killed Morgan Earp." The coroner's jury concluded that Morgan's death was caused, as they believe, from the effect of a gunshot or pistol wound by Peter Spence, Frank Stillwell, one John Doe Freeze, an Indian called Charlie, and another Indian, name unknown. But at a preliminary hearing, the testimony of Marietta was excluded as hearsay, and the charges were dismissed. Not trusting the law to punish the men who had shot their brothers, Wyatt and Warren, along with Holliday and others, would take matters into their own hands as a federal posse hunting down the Cowboys. The first to die was Frank Stillwell, shot by Wyatt after apparently trying to lie in wait to kill Virgil as he boarded a train. When lawmen described Stillwell's body as the worst shot-up man I ever saw. At least 3 more Cowboys were killed in the Vendetta Ride. The Arizona Daily Star opined that the conflict between the Earps and the Cowboys was the natural result of a quarrel between desperate men in a land where murder was rife and justice comparatively unknown. No one ever faced trial for shooting Virgil or Morgan Earp, and in fact the exact perpetrators are still unknown, although theories abound. There was never a jury trial for the death of the McClowrys and Billy Clanton in the gunfight at the OK Corral, and while there was a warrant issued for Wyatt's posse for the death of Frank Stillwell, they escaped to Colorado, where the governor refused to extradite them. In the end, the brutal Cochise County War resulted in no jury trials, no criminal convictions, justice comparatively unknown, and the whole issue simply seemed to fade away as the silver mines closed and Tombstone lost its luster. Morgan's remains were sent back to California, where he was buried by his parents. We still know so little about him for being so central to the conflict. Unlike others involved, he didn't live long enough to write a memoir, never got to tell his side of the story. Sylvan noted that as he kept no diaries, exactly what motivated him in his short life will forever remain a mystery. Of all the legends of the Wild West, the violence that surrounded 1880's Tombstone, Arizona might be the most famous. The last great boomtown of the West, the lawlessness that surrounded the silver mining town of Tombstone, included some of the most famous characters in the Wild West, like the Earp brothers and their most famous rivals, the Clanton gang. But it might not be Ike and Billy who participated in the famous gunfight at the OK Corral who are the most interesting and enigmatic of the Clantons, because the patriarch of the Clanton clan, Newman Haynes Old Man Clanton, might have been the leader of that gang of outlaws called the Cochise County Cowboys, which included famous gunmen like Tom and Frank McClowry, Curly Bill Brocious, and Johnny Ringo. Like so many characters of the West, what we know about Old Man Clanton mixes a healthy dose of legend with just a few known facts that create a history that deserves to be remembered. Newman Haynes Clanton was born in Tennessee in 1816. In 1840, he married Mariah Kelso, with whom he had 7 children, 5 sons and 2 daughters. The family moved around the West, from Tennessee to Missouri, then to California to search for gold, and then to Texas, where during the Civil War, he and his oldest son, John Wesley, served in the Confederate Home Guard. Some accounts claim that Newman was released on account of his age, although other accounts claim that both he and John Wesley eventually deserted. After the war, he moved the family again, this time to Arizona, and then back to California, where his wife Mariah passed away. There's disagreement about whether the Clantons were troublemakers or good citizens. Many in the Wild West were a mix of both. By some accounts, they had to leave California following a dispute, essentially being ridden out of town. By 1873, Newman, then usually called Old Man Clanton, had moved back to Arizona, and most of his family followed him there. They were involved in ranching and various businesses, but finally found success when, in 1877, silver was discovered in what was then Pima County of the Arizona Territory, leading to the foundation of the town of Tombstone. Mines near the town produced tens of millions of dollars in silver ore in the 1880s, and the town population grew from 100 to 14,000 in just 7 years. The Clanton Ranch was well placed to provide cattle to feed the growing population. It was a large and successful operation. In 1881, son Ike claimed to have raised or purchased some 700 cattle in a single year. But there's a problem with the story. Newman Clanton never appears to have registered a brand in Pima or Cochise counties in Arizona, which would have been required to legally raise cattle. And that leads many historians to conclude that the Clantons mostly sold stolen cattle. At the time, Mexico charged tariffs to carry goods across the border, creating an incentive for smuggling. Smugglers used a pass from Mexico to Arizona, cryptically called Skeleton Canyon. The cattle the Clantons were selling likely came from Mexico. It's possible that they were purchased from Mexicans who smuggled the cattle in to avoid the tariffs. However, it is also quite possible the cattle were stolen. Movies about Tombstone and the Earps tend to imply that the gang, called the Cowboys, were a formal organization of criminals. It's not quite the case. The group was more of a loosely organized band of acquaintances. The Cowboys worked as ranch hands, but some were involved in crimes, such as stage robbery, while others appear to have engaged in cattle rustling. Several of the Cowboys, such as the McClowry brothers, Tom and Frank, were associated with the Clantons, working as cowhands on the Clanton Ranch. At the time, the term cowboy didn't have the same meaning that it does today. People who drove cattle were usually called cowhands or drovers. In Cochise County, Arizona, the term cowboy was synonymous with cattle rustling. In 1881, the newspaper of the Tombstone Epitaph described them as thieves and cutthroats who take pride in announcing to the public that they are rustlers. Various members of the Cowboys made raids into Mexico, robbing and stealing livestock, and occasionally killing Mexican citizens. Almost certainly the Clantons procured some of this livestock, although it's not known whether they were merely purchasing from the Cowboys or whether the Clantons themselves were participating in the raids. In July of 1879, a particularly violent raid in which several men were killed drew the attention of the Mexican Rurales, the Mexican Rural Constabulary Force. The Rurales followed the trail of the murderers, illegally crossing into the U.S., where they had no authority. As the large group of Rurales reached Skeleton Canyon, they were ambushed by men hiding in the rocks. Several of the Rurales were killed, some reportedly by execution, and only a few escaped. The Mexican government filed a complaint with U.S. President Chester Arthur, but no one was ever charged with the killing. Later, a man named John Peters Ringo claimed to have been at the ambush, and that claimed, among others, that Old Man Clanton and two of his sons, Ike and Billy, had participated in the murders, along with the McClowry brothers. Ringo, better known as Johnny Ringo, had been involved in what was called the Mason County War in Texas, a series of lynchings and retribution killings over cattle rustling, and was wanted for murder there. He was a known associate of the Cowboys, and if he is to be believed regarding the Clantons' participation in the 1879 Skeleton Canyon Massacre, that suggests that they were involved in the cattle rustling in Mexico, although again, they may have simply been the buyers of the stolen cattle. Another of the Cowboys that Johnny Ringo said had participated in the massacre was William Brocious, better known as Curly Bill. A known rustler, Curly Bill was a crack pistol shot, able to hit a jackrabbit on the run. Some sources claim that Curly Bill may have participated in the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, and at one point had been in the same gang as William Bonney, better known as Billy the Kid. By other accounts, Curly Bill was wanted for murder for a killing in El Paso, Texas. Curly Bill had a mean sense of humor, and it was reported in the newspaper that he had once fired at the feet of a preacher, forcing him to dance while he preached. In 1881, Curly Bill had been accused of the murder of Tombstone Town Marshal Fred Wyatt and had been arrested by Wyatt Earp, then the undersheriff for Pima County, although at trial the shooting was ruled accidental. In July 1881, Curly Bill had, reportedly, found out that a group of Mexican smugglers was bringing a large load of silver into the United States. As the smugglers moved through Skeleton Canyon, Bill and a group of cowboys, again said to include Newman, Ike, and Bill Clanton, as well as the McClowry brothers and Johnny Ringo, ambushed them. 6 were killed in the ambush, and the remaining were hunted down and executed. You can certainly see how Skeleton Canyon got its name. Later, Skeleton Canyon would have another claim to fame when in 1886 the Apache chief Geronimo surrendered in Skeleton Canyon to General Nelson Miles. The 1881 Skeleton Canyon massacre led to speculation about a lost treasure. The story claims that so many of the smugglers' mules had been killed that the cowboys who ambushed them could not carry all the silver. After splitting the silver, they buried it. But either because the silver was moved in various attempts to double-cross each other, or because some of the cowboys were killed before they could retrieve the treasure, silver was said to be left behind. Most historians discount the rumor, as there were no reported robberies in Mexico at the time that would explain a large treasure, and the ambushers were assumed to have made off with a small take that was likely spent in the saloons of Tombstone. But once again, no one was charged with the killings, and it was not, as it turns out, the last massacre. The following August, a group of 16 Mexicans was attacked in Mexico by what was described as 25 cowboys. Several were killed, and the cattle they were herding, reportedly cattle they were retrieving from rustlers, were taken. A posse from the Mexican town of Bavispe rode out, intent on vengeance. In the morning, they happened upon a group of 7 men herding cattle in Guadalupe Pass in the Boot Heel of New Mexico, near both the Mexican and Arizona border. Assuming these to be the rustlers, the posse attacked from ambush as the group was rising for breakfast. 5 of the men were killed. 2 more escaped despite being wounded. One is reported by the Tombstone Nugget by playing dead. Among those killed was Newman Haynes Clanton, who was apparently cooking breakfast for the crew, and when shot, his body fell into the cook fire. As with so much in the Wild West, there are various stories that conflict. The most common account says that the cowboys killed, including Old Man Clanton, were indeed the rustlers, and that the posse included survivors of the 1879 Skeleton Canyon massacre, and thus revenge was also a motive. Later, rumors spread that the killers were not Mexicans, but the Earps, conducting extrajudicial killings, although there is scant evidence of such. And the survivors seem to have agreed that the attackers were Mexican. More difficult to discern is whether the men attacked were the actual men who had committed the murders in Mexico. Only one, a man named James Crane, was a suspected outlaw. The reports in Mexico were a group of 25 men, while only 7 were at the camp. It is entirely possible that the men, including Old Man Clanton, were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or possibly, once again, their role had been to buy the stolen cattle, and they may not have participated in the actual raid. Just 2 months after the death of Old Man Clanton, Ike and Billy Clanton were involved in the famous gunfight at the OK Corral against Wyatt Virgil and Morgan Earp and James Henry Doc Holliday. Billy Clanton was killed in the gunfight, along with Tom and Frank McClowry. The Earp brothers claimed that the gunfight occurred as they were trying to enforce a city ordinance against carrying firearms in town, but Ike Clanton claimed that the Earps were committing murder in order to cover up their participation in a stagecoach robbery. In trial, the Earps were acquitted, as Ike Clanton's story had a lot of inconsistencies. At the time of his death, Billy Clanton was just 19 years old. The gunfight resulted in revenge attacks on the Earps, with Town Marshal Virgil wounded, losing the use of his arm, and Morgan Earp killed, shot in the back while playing pool. Although no one was formally convicted of the crimes, Wyatt Earp took a posse that included 2 other Earp brothers, James and Warren, in search of the killers, and the so-called Earp Vendetta Ride concluded with the death of Curly Bill, shot with a shotgun by Wyatt in a shootout in March 1882. The following July, Johnny Ringo's body was found with a single bullet wound to the temple. The coroner's inquest ruled the death to be suicide, although there have long been rumors that he was killed by either Wyatt Earp or Doc Holliday. In 1887, Ike and his brother Phineas, or Finn Clanton, were charged with cattle rustling. They were surrounded by a posse. Finn gave up without a fight, but Ike tried to draw a rifle and was shot to death by a detective that had been hired by local cattle ranchers. Finn served time in jail for rustling and had another couple of brushes with the law, died of an accident in 1906. The oldest brother, John Wesley, never relocated to Arizona. He stayed in California. He died of natural causes in 1916. Of all of them, the most interesting might have been Old Man Clanton. Clearly he associated with outlaws, and he almost certainly sold stolen cattle, but the extent of his participation in their crimes is still really unknown. Some claim that he was the ruthless leader of the Cochise County Cowboys and was replaced by Curly Bill after his death. Whether he was just a man trying to make a living on the edge of the law, or whether he was central to the robbery, rustling, and murder committed by the Cochise County Cowboys is still a matter of dispute in a life that is more defined by legend than known fact. Josephine Earp, Wyatt Earp's common-law wife for more than 40 years, has a shadowy and largely unknown history, and during her life she seemed to want it that way. Towards the end of her life, she worked hard, sued to prevent the publication of books that purported to talk about her relationship with Wyatt Earp, and especially the era when they were in Tombstone, Arizona. But through the shadows, some details do emerge. She loved Wyatt Earp. She loved a life of adventure, and a life lived on her own terms. Josephine Sarah Marcus Earp deserves to be remembered. There are no extant records proving the birth date of Josephine Marcus, but the lady herself believed that she was born on June 2nd, 1860, in New York City. Her parents were Henry Marcus and Sophie Lewis, Jewish immigrants. Henry Marcus was from Prussia, specifically the province of Posen. He worked as a baker. In the New World, there were class distinctions in the burgeoning Jewish community, drawn between the immigrants from Germany and the immigrants from Prussia. The German Jewish population saw itself as more educated than their Prussian counterparts. The Jewish population from Prussia was more likely to speak Yiddish and work as craftsmen. They were also excluded from some of the higher circles in Jewish society. Later in life, Josephine described her father as a German merchant, perhaps in an effort to put herself in the more highly favored Jewish community. The Marcus family moved from New York City to San Francisco in the 1860s and appeared on the federal census rolls in 1870. San Francisco itself was booming from an 1849 gold rush and had one of the largest Jewish populations in the world at the time. Josephine's father continued to work as a baker, and the family moved around several times, according to the historical record preserved in San Francisco city directories. Josephine and her sister, Henrietta, attended school, which Josephine did not seem to enjoy. Instead, she favored the bright lights of the stage and relished music and singing lessons. The HMS Pinafore, a musical by Gilbert and Sullivan, took the world by storm after its debut in 1878. It was unprotected by an international copyright and so popular that theater troupes struggled to keep up with demand for the performances. The Pinafore was performed in multiple languages in the United States, appealing to immigrants from around the world. Josephine and the daughter of her voice coach ran away from San Francisco to join the theater troupe of established actress Pauline Markham in order to perform the Pinafore. Some historians believe that Josephine may have used the stage name May Bell because there were no Josephine Marcuses listed as traveling with the Markham troupe. She would later say, "There was far too much excitement in the air for one to remain long a child." Josephine was with the troupe when it arrived in Tombstone in December 1879. She was always described as a beautiful, voluptuous woman by those that knew her. Josephine had brown eyes and glossy brown hair with a figure that one of her friends said entered the room before her. Bat Masterson, one of the most famous lawmen of the American Wild West, said of Josephine, "She was the belle of the honky-tonks, the prettiest dame in 300 or so of her kind." She was spotted on her first trip to Tombstone by Johnny Behan. Behan was short, with a quick smile and sparkling black eyes. Josephine was warned away from him by some of the troupe, who told her that he was already married, but evidently their flirtation continued, because when the theater troupe eventually broke up and Josephine returned to her family in San Francisco, Behan's letters showed up on her doorstep sometime later. He asked for Josephine to return to Tombstone and marry him. Josephine's family allowed her to return to the mining town. After living through her runaway period, perhaps they were becoming used to her unconventional life choices. She lived in Tombstone with Behan and his son Albert from his first marriage to a woman named Victoria. During their divorce proceedings, Victoria said, "I have been driven nearly to distraction by Behan's behavior and penchant for visiting houses of ill repute." She accused him of continual drunkenness, abusiveness, and threatening to throw her out of the house. This was the man Josephine was now living with, and contrary to what he may have written to her, they did not get married right away. At first, Behan said that he wanted to earn more money before marrying, but then as his career progressed and money became less of an issue, it became clear to Josephine that he just didn't want to get married at all. Meanwhile, another man who would feature prominently in Josephine's life, Wyatt Earp, was living in Tombstone with his common-law wife, Celia Mattie Blaylock. Earp was memorably handsome and laconic. The mayor of Tombstone, John Clum, said Earp was tall, erect, manly, serene, and in neat attire. I still have a clear vision of that dignified figure walking calmly along Allen Street. Earp was in town with his brothers Virgil and Morgan, running a saloon, prospecting, and generally trying to make a living for himself. Virgil's common-law wife, Elvira Packingham Sullivan Earp, whom everyone called Allie, later recalled their years in Tombstone as hard scrabble. She said, "That was our life, working and sitting home. Good women didn't go anyplace. Everything was nice if you had money, and we didn't, so it wasn't. Life was even more difficult for Josephine, who didn't even have a common-law marriage. Though she called herself Mrs. Bean and received her mail under that name, Josephine knew it wasn't true. Josephine and Wyatt Earp's paths crossed when Bean and Earp ran a fierce campaign against each other in an effort to become the first sheriff of Cochise County in Arizona Territory. Bean promised Earp he would appoint him as his deputy if Earp let him have the post. Earp acquiesced, but then Bean was elected and didn't follow through on his promise. There was a permanent grudge between the two men because of it. Meanwhile, Josephine had left Bean after she had discovered him in bed with the wife of a friend, and he had begun to display symptoms of syphilis. It is unclear when Josephine and Wyatt Earp began their love affair, but it was most likely sometime in the summer of 1881. Occupations were limited for single women at the time, so Josephine may have been working as a theater performer or a prostitute or both. Or perhaps she was simply looking for the protection of another man, which was probably easier in the booming town of Tombstone, where frontier men outnumbered the women almost 9-1. When the explosive events unfolded at the OK Corral in October of 1881, Josephine would later tell relatives that she saw it and checked to make sure that Wyatt Earp was still alive afterwards. But then she would leave Tombstone. Earp sent Mattie to live with his parents while he went on what was called his vendetta ride for the murder of his brother Morgan. The shootout at the OK Corral and what followed divided public opinion then and in the years following. Clara Brown, a Tombstone resident who had a column in the San Francisco newspaper, wrote, "Opinion is pretty fairly divided as to the justification of the killing. You may meet one man who will support the Earps and declare that no other course was possible to save their own lives, and the next man is just as likely to assert that there was no occasion whatsoever for bloodshed." Following the events that catapulted Earp and his companions into legend, he never went to pick Mattie up from his parents, because he instead went to San Francisco, where Josephine had moved back in with her parents, and asked her to share her life with him. Mattie took being abandoned badly. She began working as a prostitute again and eventually overdosed from laudanum she had become addicted to. Josephine, perhaps embarrassed by the part she played in creating Mattie's unhappiness, wanted to sweep the entire period of Tombstone from her life. Some historians have asserted that Josephine Marcus was actually working as a prostitute in Tombstone under the name Sadie Mansfield. They take as evidence the fact that Johnny Bean's favorite prostitute was a Sadie Mansfield, who went by the name $40 Sadie, and then connect that to Josephine's own admitted connection with Johnny Bean. Wyatt Earp actually called her Sadie, which is a play on her middle name Sarah, but other historians disagree, taking as evidence that there are people in Tombstone who claim to have known both Sadie Mansfield and Josephine Marcus and said they were two different people. But whatever the case, it adds to that mystery surrounding Josephine Marcus's time in Tombstone. Now together, Josephine and Earp began a nomadic lifestyle that led them from town to town seeking their fortunes across the West. They dwelt for a time in Utah, Colorado, Texas, Idaho, and Nevada, opening saloons and gambling. In 1887, Earp owned more than 2 blocks of valuable real estate in San Diego. It was one of their more successful ventures during their time together, until the real estate boom ended and Earp had to sell the properties. Josephine had a particular fondness for betting on horse races that she shared with Earp. She said, "This love of horseflesh, coupled with his susceptibility to the wiles of Lady Luck, formed a combination that made it almost inevitable that at some time during his career, the horse racing game should claim him." Josephine would later claim that she and Earp were married on the yacht of one of her more famous gambling friends, Elias J. Lucky Baldwin, but the historical documentation to support this claim has not been found. Earp entered the limelight again when he was accused of fixing a heavyweight championship boxing match between Tom Sharkey and Bob Fitzsimmons in December 1896. First, Earp drew the ire of the crowd when he walked into the ring still wearing his gun under his coat. And then Earp called a controversial foul on the favored winner, Fitzsimmons, and awarded the fight to Sharkey. Newspapers had a field day printing stories about the lawman's so-called corruption and created cartoons showing a gun-wielding Earp ordering boxers about in a ring. His Tombstone days were dug up and examined once more. Josephine said, "The old lies came bobbing to the surface of the ocean of printed matter." Josephine and Earp, partially to escape the hounding press, made the decision to go to Nome, Alaska for the gold rush taking place on the beaches. They were delayed in their departure because Earp suffered an accident where he badly bruised his hip and would be unable to walk the demanding trails of the Alaskan wilderness. Josephine, for her part, had recovered from a miscarriage. She would later say, "God didn't make me right for having children." But it apparently didn't make her bitter, as she adored the infants of her friends and extended family, and even maintained a special relationship with Johnny Behan's son from his first marriage, Albert, for the rest of her life. Once both were fully recovered, they made their way north and spent their first winter at Rampart, Alaska. Josephine said this is one of the most happy periods of her life. She described taking a loaf of fresh bread out of the oven as Earp came home one night in a storm. He sniffed, his eyes lighted with pleasure. "Snug as a bug in a rug," he exclaimed. "On such small hinges does the door to contentment swing." They moved on from Rampart to Nome, where Earp opened up a saloon he named the Dexter. Business was booming, but Josephine didn't approve of Earp's establishment, especially after rooms were built above the main floor for prostitutes to use. She tried to get Earp to throw the women out, but he refused. High-stakes poker games took place at the Dexter, with as much as $500,000 in gold dust being bet on a single hand. Josephine said she believed Earp had affairs during their time together in Nome, and some historians claim that Josephine had her own dalliances. They eventually moved back to the continental U.S. and slowly faded into old age. But the former lawman and his paramour found it difficult to fit into a world where prohibition was taking hold and gambling was outlawed in a number of places. Josephine continued her almost compulsive gambling habit, and it took a toll on their finances. An Earp biographer wrote, "Times have changed. People think differently. What were established businesses yesterday are considered vices today and have been outlawed." Wyatt Earp died January 13th, 1929. His final words were uttered the night before when he said, supposing, and he never finished the thought, something which Josephine lamented for the rest of her life. She had his body cremated and buried in the Marcus plot at the Jewish cemetery, Eternity Memorial Park in California. She spent the remainder of her years fighting with publishers and writers in an effort to protect Earp's reputation and her own. In one letter she wrote, "During the past few years, many wrong impressions of the early days of Tombstone and myself have been created by writers who are not informed correctly, and this has caused me concern, which I feel deeply." Practically penniless, Josephine died December 19th, 1944. On the world stage, the Battle of the Bulge was still going on. Her funeral arrangements were paid for by William S. Hart, the actor, and Sidney Grauman, the founder of the world-famous Grauman's Chinese Theater. She was buried at Eternity Memorial Park, next to Wyatt. In the period since her life and death, historians have argued over the murky details of the life of Josephine Marcus Earp, who she was, where she went, what she did, and even what she was like. But in amongst all the drama and the excitement of the world-famous gunfight at the OK Corral, people seem to forget that there was one woman who loved both Wyatt Earp and Johnny Bean, two of the leaders of the two factions in the fight. And that makes it more than just a fight between gunfighters over revenge. It makes it a love story, and a love story that deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.